Americans continue to lose trust in our government at the highest levels. It's kind of a shocking case out of Michigan that, honestly, I've never seen anything like this on a national level. So you remember that back during the election cycle of 2020, there was this rather shocking plot that apparently some men in Michigan, militia members, had planned to kidnap and maybe kill the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. Well, now it turns out that two men who were involved in this supposed plot, they've now been acquitted. And the reason they were acquitted is it turns out that FBI agents basically almost compelled them to involve themselves in the plot. According to the New York Times, it was one of the country's highest profile domestic terrorism cases, an alleged plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, eliminate her security detail, perhaps touch off a civil war. But after a trial in which prosecutors portrayed the four defendants as threats to democracy, jurors on Friday acquitted two of the men and said they were unable to reach verdicts for the other two. The result was a major blow to the Justice Department, which during the Biden administration has made domestic terrorism one of its top priorities. The defendants in the Michigan trial were arrested weeks before the 2020 election. The case was seen by some as revealing increasingly combative discourse among certain right-wing groups, but a series of missteps during the investigation and the eventual failure to win any convictions against the men who went to trial raises questions about the ability of federal law enforcement, when it infiltrates right-wing groups, to develop convincing cases without infringing on the rights to speak freely and own weapons. And this is one of the problems, is that very often the FBI will deploy people into the middle of these cases. And instead of the FBI just watching and observing and then bringing evidence, the FBI, apparently, in this particular case, was basically whipping up the fury and encouraging people to engage in criminal activity and then seeking to have these people arrested. Prosecutors built their case on a trove of audio recordings and encrypted texts from 2020, in which some of the men vented about COVID-19 restrictions, spoke about political violence, and debated the best way to kidnap Whitmer from her vacation home in northern Michigan. Yet the very existence of those recordings and text conversations underscored the defense theory of the case, that the supposed plot had actually been conceived and nudged ahead by a network of FBI agents and informants who preyed on the worst instincts of their loose-lipped targets. The defense lawyers described the men on trial as big talkers who were never going to commit any kidnapping. Words hurt you, words scare you, Daniel Harris, who was acquitted of all the charges against him, had said when he took the stand in his own defense. Harris insisted he never joined any plot. He referred derisively to an FBI informant, Dan Chappell, who had testified earlier in the trial that he feared the group's anti-government and anti-law enforcement rhetoric would escalate into violence. Issues with the action of some FBI agents also loomed over the trial, though little of that was explicitly discussed in front of jurors. One FBI agent was fired last year after being charged with domestic violence. Another agent, who supervised Chappell, tried to build a private security consulting firm based in his work in the FBI, according to a BuzzFeed News report. The jury of 6 men and 6 women didn't reach any verdict on the charges against 2 of the defendants. A judge declared a mistrial for those men and ordered them held in jail. The others have been charged in connection with the investigation, have pled guilty before the trial to kidnapping, conspiracy, and testified against the defendants in a federal case. But apparently, the 2 who were hit with a mistrial are probably going to be retried. Prosecutors kept showing jurors inflammatory social media posts and chat messages from the defendants, and they presented audio recordings from Chappell and other informants. One former co-defendant who pled guilty testified he hoped to set off a chain of events that prevent Joe Biden from being elected and perhaps foment a civil war. But the prosecution's case was hampered by lack of clarity on what exactly the men were accused of plotting. No attack ever took place. No final date for an abduction was actually set. The details of the alleged plan sometimes differ dramatically from prosecution witness to prosecution witness. The FBI informant, Chappell, said he believed the group planned to kill Whitmer, whose handling of the COVID-19 pandemic had infuriated the men. Mr. Garvin, who earlier pled guilty, said he thought the group of men might abandon the governor in a boat in the middle of Lake Michigan. Mr. Franks told jurors he had hoped to die in a shootout with the governor's security detail. Joshua Blanchard, a lawyer for one of the defendants, said, quote, "There was no plan to kidnap the governor. There was no agreement between these 4 men." He said the government tried to conjure up a conspiracy by using a network of informants and undercover agents, and that without a plan, the snitches needed to make it look like there was movement toward a plan. Okay, the reason this is such a mess for the government is that, of course, this has some implications for the January 6th defendants, because some of the case that's been made by defendants in that case is that a lot of people were basically whipped into a frenzy, not by Trump's speech per se, but by alleged FBI informants in the crowd. And the FBI is now admitting that there were, in fact, informants in the crowd. According to the Wall Street Journal, the DOJ has expanded its investigation into the January 6th riot and is gearing up for summer trials in some of the most serious related cases brought so far, just as some cracks in prosecutors' strategies have started to emerge. In recent weeks, a judge issued the first full acquittal among hundreds of cases. That was a man who said he believed that the police ushered him into the building, and acquitted another man of a more serious charge that he faced. In that case, Judge Trevor McFadden said the defendants didn't engage in the violence. And also, there is in fact tape of police officers ushering people into the building. Another possible complicating factor for the government. And this is, again, pretty troublesome for prosecution. At least a half dozen Federal Bureau of Investigation informants were in the crowd at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th as a pro-Trump mob stormed the building, according to people familiar with the matter, who say none of them appears to have been sent there by the Bureau to engage in or encourage violence. Defense lawyers are pressing the FBI for information about those informants. The informants could be an issue as prosecutors prepare for their first trial in July on sedition and other charges against members of the right-wing militia Oath Keepers, as well as a potential August trial for members of the Proud Boys. The presence of informants could open the door for defense attorneys to argue that their clients were coerced into violence. The FBI is not commenting on the informants. They're citing standing practice against talking about sources. And again, this is going to be the case the defense makes, that people didn't really mean to go into the building. They were whipped up by members of the FBI. We'll have to see what sort of evidence emerges on that. Certainly, if the FBI informants were doing that sort of thing, that is pretty nasty stuff. I mean, that tears at the fabric of the United States. You want criminals to actually be criminals, not people who are encouraged by federal law enforcement to get involved in the criminality. Joy Reid, of course, you can count on her for the stupidest take on the Michigan case. She says, of course, this is about the defendants being white, is because black people are never, ever, ever acquitted of things, ever, except for the murder conviction rate is actually lower for homicide cases, depending on race. Joy Ann Reid says, quote, unreal. So in America, in the year of our Lord 2022, you can plot to kidnap a Democratic woman governor to stage a show trial and hurt her or worse because you don't like COVID restrictions and walk, as long as you're a white right-wing extremist, holy jury nullification Batman. Or actually, it wasn't jury nullification. It turns out that there are widespread reports leading up to the trial that the FBI informants had been deeply involved in the actual planning of the supposed kidnapping that was set to go down. All of that tears at the social fabric of the United States. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.